Get started here. And thank you all so much for joining us. This is tons of fun for us, and we really appreciate the opportunity to give back. So, okay, welcome to the Northeast Engineers HVAC podcast. And today we are starting a 3-part series in Psychrometrics. And this is part 1, which is how to read a psychrometric chart. We will publish part 2 here shortly. I'm actually going to get with Kevin after this show here, and we'll pick a date and we'll publish that and we'll send out emails. So if you registered for this, you'll get an email not only with a PDH certificate for coming here, but a link to the next show as well. So this special edition is New York and New Jersey and Pennsylvania approved. Okay, so that's not all of our presentations are approved in all 3 of those states because of the process, but this one is, and it's brought to you specifically by Klima New York, Klima New Jersey, EBS, ETS, Energy Transfer Solutions, Insight Partners, and Hobbs and Associates. This presentation qualifies for PDH credits in New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Virginia, Tennessee, Maryland, Alabama, Delaware, Mississippi, West Virginia, Arkansas, and many, many other states. At the end of this presentation, you can email me at tmormino@insightUSA.com. We will put that email up here throughout the presentation. If you're listening to this in the future, that email address will be in the description of the podcast. There you go. It's on the screen in the podcast or in the video description. So, and hello to everybody. I see a bunch more people joining us. Thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. I am Tony Mormino with Insight Partners. I'm your host today, and I'm joined by Kevin Quillinan, who's the principal and technical sales engineer at Klima, New Jersey. And how are you doing today, Kevin?
Doing great. Glad to be here again. This is fun. Like I like hopping on any opportunity I get.
Awesome. No, we're grateful to have you. And this is a lot of fun. If you've not tried it, once you get over the fear, it took me about 100 episodes where I wasn't terrified, but now I'm starting to get comfortable with it after a couple of years. So it is nice and fun. So today,
and the good thing is anytime you land a joke, you can just tell yourself everyone laughed because no one can tell you if it didn't hit.
It's surprising how unfunny I am in person because now I can just envision everybody like right now, everybody's out there laughing at our funniness, right?
Yeah, 100%.
100%. Okay. So getting down to business here, we're going to talk about how to read the psychrometric chart. Okay. And, a lot of times when we bring up this topic, and even myself, I'm like, gosh, could it be more boring? And I will admit it is kind of boring, but, you have to look at least from my perspective, why is this important? Like, why do we need to know this? And I could tell you in my career, when I started in 97, I actually started with a company. I hear there's a choo-choo train in your background, I think.
Yeah, our office is next to the track. I'm going to turn down my mic for a second.
It's totally fine. It's no big deal. I'm just making a joke. So when I started in my career, I actually had 3 months of psychrometric training every day for 5 days for 3 months during the week. And it's really helped me a lot in my career. I can tell you without that fundamental foundation, it would really have been hard for me to understand the basics of psychrometrics in terms of how an air conditioner works and really understanding the sequence of operation. When you look at I'm trying to achieve 72 degrees and 50% RH in a space, what sequence of operation do I have to have given the different conditions of the outside air, the return air, et cetera? So psychrometrics for me has been invaluable. That's why we invest a lot as a company and companies like Kevin's to try and give back to the HVAC community and teach this because it's so super important. Kevin, what role has psychrometrics played in your career?
Yeah, I think overall, having those fundamental building blocks and understanding these less complex items gives you the ability to troubleshoot anything that's more complex. Additionally, there are multiple times where we're having issues in the field. Let's say it's, ductwork, condensing, or space conditions that they're not, that aren't exactly, where they want them to be. The psychrometric chart, if you take a second to step back, plot what you're looking for, and actually understand the conditions that you're seeing inside the room, it can really give you the opportunity to look at things in a different way that you may not have by just, walking up to a thermostat and start pushing buttons.
I totally agree 100%. And I recommend to people, oh, by the way, Courtney, can you drop the link to the psych chart? I forgot to mention, this is kind of a play along kind of presentation. If you have a psych chart, great. If you don't, you can Google psychrometric chart and a bunch will pop up. Courtney has also put in the link to our psychrometric chart if you want to download that. I'm sorry, I should have mentioned that earlier, but if you want to follow along, this is a good opportunity. And if you're listening to this in the future, pause this, print one out, because we're actually going to ask you to go through and circle some things. But okay, so thank you, Kevin. I totally agree. And I recommend people if you're new, carry around a psychrometric chart and get a couple of tools like something like this and take some readings, especially if you could put this in an air handling unit and get the return and get the outside air and get the supply air, then you could really start to see what's going on with the unit, even if you're just trying to learn or troubleshoot or whatever. The other thing, Psychrometrics, I would say is, sometimes I'm on a job site and it's like a hospital or cancer research center. I'm like, wow, these people trust me to like help design their equipment. It's one thing on the screen, but when you get out to the site, you're like, this is a big responsibility. So I take it as, we owe it to the people who entrust in us, whether it's our employers or it's our, customers, our engineers, our owners, to really have a good understanding of this. So I'm Tony Mormino. I'm in Asheville, North Carolina. Kevin, why don't you introduce yourself? Talk a little bit about who you are.
Yeah, Kevin Quillinan with Klima, New Jersey, one of the principals here, and I live right where you see that Long Branch on that map there, right above that in Red Bank, New Jersey.
Nice, and I can't wait to come up to visit you guys soon. It'll be fun.
Yeah.
All right, so we're talking about the psych chart. So Willis Carrier, anyone heard of him? 1911 is credited for inventing the psychrometric chart. And, psychrometry, I'm just going to read this here. Psychrometry is the science of air properties and processes of heating, cooling, dehumidification, and humidification. It is also the cornerstone science of HVAC engineering. Again, the chart is credited to Willis Carrier in 1911. It comes from the Greek word sukron, meaning cold, and metron, meaning means of measurement. Some information there that's not extremely useful, but I think it's kind of interesting. Psychrometrics is not confined to the world of air conditioning. It is used in the fields of agriculture and aeronautical engineering, food engineering, drying of crops, grains, and pharmaceuticals, dehydration, meteorology, and weather reporting. So we're not the only ones that use psychrometrics, but we use it a lot. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about the properties of air. Then we're going to look at building the chart. And then we're going to look at moving around the chart and then determining the air properties. So 4 distinct sections here. Again, if you have a chart, grab it. We'll reference it a few times. If you need a chart, you can Google search it, or you can click on the link that Courtney provided here. And if you're watching this in the future, I'll put that link to the psych chart in the description of the podcast or video. So, all right. So properties of air. So we're going to talk about dry bulb, wet bulb, dew point, relative humidity, and enthalpy. Okay. And as long as I've been around, I'm still, a lot of people who are around a long time get a little bit confused still with relative humidity and dew point versus wet bulb and stuff like that. So we're going to go through and give you, if you're new, you're going to get it for the first time. If not, maybe a little bit of a refresher. So I've done this presentation 100 times and, we never talk about air. What is air, right? I was walking the other day. I was like, why don't we put a slide in about that? So air is not space. It's a thing in the space, right? That's made up of nitrogen, oxygen, which is good. Other gases, about 1% of other gases, mostly argon, whatever the heck that is. And then carbon dioxide, which is 0.04% of the atmosphere. And that's in the news a lot, of course, because of global warming issues and stuff like that. ASHRAE guidelines recommend a temperature range of 68 to 74 degrees and an RH of 30 to 60%. So humans are most comfortable in those ranges. Like right now in my office, it's 73 degrees, dry bulb, and 49% RH, which is ideal for me. I like this kind of temperature. And that's what we do in our business, right? We try to get the indoor space to have that temperature and that humidity. Okay. All right. Now we're going to take a big risk here and go to we're calling it the Psych Cam for short, the Psychrometric Cam. So why don't we go to the second camera and we'll turn that on, and we're going to look at the properties of air using some props, which is kind of fun and a little terrifying at the same time. So let me see if I can get this working here. So, all right. So we're going to talk about dry bulb first because that's the easiest one. So the dry bulb temperature is the temperature you find on a standard thermometer. So I got this at the hardware store across the street. I actually got 2 of them for about $4, a pretty good deal. But you can see the dry bulb temperature in this room is about 72-ish degrees or something along those lines. See if I get this to focus. But okay, there we go. So dry bulb temperature, the temperature you see on the news, it's going to be high at 95 today. That's the dry bulb temperature. The important thing to note is it's independent of the moisture in the air, right? The dry bulb does not care how humid it is or how much humidity is in the air. It only cares about what's called sensible heat, which we talk about more in presentation number 2. And the reason it's called dry bulb is we're going to show you in a minute. Okay, dry bulb temperature doesn't care about humidity, doesn't know how humid it is. It's not affected by humidity. Okay. As opposed to wet bulb, which is affected by humidity. So this is the first time I've used this tool here, which is called, if you're new, this is called a sling psychrometer. I'm trying to get that to focus. I think how's that look, Kevin? You see that?
Okay. Yeah, it looks good. Yeah, if you tilt it a little bit, there you go. You got the red now. Yep.
Numbers there. So that looks like about 75 degrees, if I'm not mistaken. We'll try to get up. There you go. Okay. So here's what this contraption is. So there's 2 glass thermometers in here. The thermometers are identical, except for there's what we call a wick or a sock on the bottom thermometer. We'll talk about why that is here in a second. So what happens is wet bulb is an indicator of how much moisture is in the air. So what you do is you take a dropper, we're going to do this in a second, and you wet this sock here. Okay. And the amount of moisture in the air will determine how much evaporation you get off this sock. So if it's super dry, Kevin, how much evaporation will we get as opposed to if the air is very wet?
You'll get more evaporation.
More evaporation. Excellent. So what happens when the air evaporates from the wick is it cools this lower bulb. Okay. So the drier the air, the more evaporation, the cooler the temperature will read on the bottom thermometer. The reason it's called a wet bulb is because we're wetting the bulb. We're wetting the cotton wick over the bulb. So if the air is super saturated, you're not going to get a lot of evaporation. That's evaporation, by the way. That's what evaporation looks like in my like this. You're not going to get a lot of evaporation, and your wet bulb temperature is going to be very close to the dry bulb. That means it's very humid wherever you're measuring the conditions, right? So the wet bulb will always be either equal to or lower than the dry bulb. That's the other thing. Unless somebody knows of a scenario where the wet bulb could be higher than the dry bulb, you can put it in the chat and correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think it's possible. Okay. So what do you think? We're ready to give this thing a whirl?
Yeah. And I think one thing that's good to point out right now is because that wick is not wet, you can see the temperatures are the same. So we're going to, we expect that temperature to drop on that lower thermometer. Excellent
point. All right. So we're going to give this a whirl, literally give it a whirl. So this thing spins. So I'm a little bit scared to do that live on LinkedIn. By the way, I think this is about to be a groundbreaking event. I don't think a sling psychrometer has ever been slung live on LinkedIn before. So we might be breaking new grounds here. Might be breaking this thermometer. Yeah, you do that. Let me make sure I got that good and wet. Okay. All right, I've been wanting to get one of these for years, so I'm glad I got it. All right, so I'm going to try to spin this and not hit myself. It's supposed to spin for 20 seconds, Kevin, so you tell me when that's up.
All right.
All right.
So far, so good. Haven't hit anything.
Huh?
So far, so good. Haven't hit anything.
All right, so I'm gonna assume the lower thermometer is going to read a cooler temperature than the one on top, which is dry, right? Because it's pretty comfy in here. It's pretty cozy in here. What do you think? Is that 20 seconds?
Yep.
My arm's getting tired. Okay. I'm calling it 20 seconds. All right, let's see what we got here.
Yep, we'll back more towards you. Yep.
Get it to focus here, but a little hard to see online, but the temperature is much lower on the bottom one.
Yep.
We'll give this a second. So, if it was real humid and ooh, there we go. That's nice. Okay. So 70, what do you think, Kevin? You tell me 72,
72, 60, 263.
All right. You want to write those down for me? Cause we'll reference those later. You got something to write on. 72 dry bulb. Thank you. 70, 63. 63. You nailed it. Okay. All right. So I hope that demonstrates wet bulb. Yeah, Paul, I am using tap water. You're supposed to use distilled water. So someone called me. I got busted, man. Hey, I don't have any with me. You get what you get here. Okay, so you get the point. The point of that is you get the point. So that's how you measure wet bulb. That's why you hear the terms wet bulb and dry bulb. So, okay, let's see what we have next on the list. Now we're going to demonstrate dew point. So dew point is a temperature at which a surface will condense water, right? So I'm going to use this tool, which is a digital version of what we just looked at. Okay. So the dew point temperature in this room, a little less fun. That's right. Probably not as accurate either. I bet that sling is more accurate than this thing. By the way, I have 5 thermometers here and humidity readers, and they all say something different. So, there you go. Dew point in this room is about 54.3 degrees. So what that means is any surface colder than that will condense water on it. Will start to condense water. So, if we were bringing this through a cooling coil right now, the cooling coil would have to be lower than that dew point. Now, that's a pretty low dew point. So to get something to sweat in here is going to be a little difficult, but I'm going to give it a try. Okay.
I feel like this was one of those college questions with the cool professor. How long does it take to cool a beer can or make it condense?
Yeah, exactly. So this is probably going to be a big fail because I tried it 4 times and it didn't work. But let me see if I can get a good reading off this can. Okay, so this came out of the freezer. It says 48 degrees. It's got to be colder than that. 43 degrees. Okay, so 43 degrees. So it's a little wet because it came out of the cooler, but this will sweat in this space because the dew point's 54. So the point here is anything colder than the dew point is going to cause condensation, which is why we make cooling coils colder than the dew point of the air. That's how we remove humidity. That's the only way we remove humidity with a cooling coil. We do remove humidity with desiccants as well. So,
yep. And it also shows a good example of, besides we don't want thermal losses through ductwork. That's why we're always insulating our supply ductwork, right? If we're supplying 55-degree air, anything that's going to touch that's above that is going to, or below that is going to, above that's going to condense.
Absolutely. And that's the temperature of the can, 43 degrees. I think it's actually colder than that. I'm not sure how accurate this is, but you can see it's already starting to have a ton of condensation on it. So, Okay. That's the dew point example. Did I miss anything there?
No.
You got that? I'm going to move the mini psych chart and I'm going to move this over. All right. What are we doing next here? Now we're doing relative humidity. I like this example because this really helps me a lot. So relative humidity is the amount of moisture in the air compared to how much it can hold at a specific temperature. It is relative to the temperature of the air, hence the name relative humidity. So we're going to illustrate that by using these beakers. Okay. So let's say you had a volume of air, container of air at 55 degrees, which is represented by this. You heated it up to 75 degrees. You would expect to expand, right? Up to 95 degrees. What would it look like in these beakers if they were at a 50% RH, 50% relative humidity state? Well, they would be half full of water, in my opinion. So let's go ahead and try to fill these up. Make sure I got that pretty close. Bunch of engineers on here, so I might get some comments. You know what I mean? Okay, so that looks like halfway full. So 50% RH at 75 degrees. What do you think, Kevin? Am I getting close?
That was a nice pour. Yeah. Very good. If this is a drinking game, you would have won that one.
I have done this a few times. Okay. What do you think? I think that's close enough. Okay. All right. So you would expect these beakers to look something like this if these were 50% full. So air versus how much it can hold, 50% degrees, 50% RH at 75 degrees, and 50% RH at 95 degrees. Now, here's the important lesson here. What do you notice about the volume of water in this beaker versus this beaker? Well, the volume of water is much greater here, but they both have the same reading of 50% relative humidity. Okay, and therein lies the issue when using RH to determine the actual amount of moisture in the air, because it is relative to the temperature that the air is at. So the higher the temperature, the more water it can hold, yada, yada, yada. Make sense, Kevin? Anything to add?
Absolutely. No, I mean, one of the things that I will run into sometimes when people are, not satisfied with the relative humidity in a space is people tend to try to turn down the temperature. I think this gives a really good example. If we were to take that, if all we cared about was relative humidity and decreasing relative humidity, and we took that, 55-degree beaker and poured it into the 75, our relative humidity is going to be lower.
Yep. And conversely, if we took, well, not necessarily conversely, but if we took so Kevin has a great point. So let's use this example of a 95-degree air at 50% RH. And let's say you cooled this down quickly to 75 degrees.
Mm-hmm.
The relative humidity it actually would overflow, which I'm not going to do that here because it would make a huge mess, but you get the point. It would be saturated. You'd get fog. You'd get condensation on your cooling coil, etc. So that's kind of what happens there. Okay. So that's a relative humidity example. I hope that helps people. We'll look at a little bit further in the presentation. We'll talk about relative humidity versus dew point. I feel like I forgot something there, but I think that's good. Okay. Now we're going to talk about humidity, also called absolute humidity. And I think I need one of these, don't I? I need this one.
Yeah.
Okay. Humidity is expressed in grains per pound of dry air. Okay, so what is a grain? A grain is a unit of measurement. It is 1/7,000th of a pound, and it's often used to weigh things like bullets, arrows, medicine, pharmaceuticals, etc., and other things. I have a list here I was going to read, but I can't find it. Okay, here it is. Yeah. And in our industry, it's used to weigh water. So it's used to weigh very small things, typically in small quantities, small weights. So the first example is this here. So a drop of water, I guess I'll put it on this paper towel here. I don't know how well you could see that, but one drop of water is about 4.5 grains. Okay, so that's 4.5 grains, just to give you an idea. Boink. Okay. Now let's take the grains of a hot, humid day, at least around here, would be 9578, which is 120 grains. So what would 120 grains look like? Well, to do that, we're going to take this scale and we're going to turn it on and we're going to change the unit to grams. Okay, so 120 grains is approximately 8 grams. Okay, so I'm going to fill this up with 8 grams of water to get you an example of 120 grains. If I could do this without overshooting it, it will be an absolute miracle. I didn't really practice this a whole lot. So there you go. 12. Now you got 12. Now that's a real humid day. So let's see if I can back off that a little bit. Nine grams. Oh, man.
Close.
I might get stuck in a loop. I might just tell me to stop. Someone tell me to stop.
I just have one more shot.
Okay. How could that not be 9? How could that not be 8? All right. All right. I'm sure that's going to be like 6 or 7.
Hey, nice.
We got it. Okay. So 8 grams of water, that is 120 grains per pound of dry air. That's what a very humid day looks like. So picture this amount of water, 8 grams of water, okay, in 1 pound of dry air. So the next question is, what does a pound of dry air look like? Well, I was doing this demonstration with my friend Tom Peterson at CDI, and he had a great tool to show what a pound of air looks like. So Heather, can you hit the big camera? The main camera? or just make it bigger. There you go. So this is what a pound of air is 13.5 cubic feet of air, or I should say 13.5 cubic feet of air at 72 degrees, 50%, I believe, is a pound of air. So if you, and that volume looks like this. Okay. That'll make a good social media post right there. Boom. Okay. So that represents, so think about that. And then think about 8 grams of moisture. So that's what it looks like on a very humid day. So grains per pound of dry air is what's going on there. Okay. So by the way, if anybody has any questions, please put them in the chat. We didn't talk about that. So, okay, I think that's it. Heather, if you can go to the presentation mode, we'll continue this prezo. Okay, the last property of air, which we're not going to talk about it a whole lot, which is enthalpy, which is the total energy in 1 pound of air. It's in BTUs per pound of dry air. We talk about that more in Psychrometrics 2 and 3. So we're not going to talk about that a whole lot here. But basically, it's the total energy of the air. It's very, very important. All right. Leaving the properties of air, we're going to go now. And again, ask questions, please, if you'd like. We'll try to answer them when we can. Next, we're going to talk about building the chart. So when you first look at a chart, it's extremely intimidating, or at least it was for me, especially if you're not mathematically inclined. It could be very scary. There's tons of stuff on here, but we're going to break it down. Now that we know the properties of air, we're going to kind of break the chart down and show you where they fit in the chart. And it's actually pretty simple once you do it in this fashion, I think. So we're going to look at a chart. We're going to digitally break this down. We're going to pull, draw an outline here. So when you see this outline, it basically represents the chart. And then I'm going to have Kevin to kind of walk through here and talk about the properties of air and where they fit on the chart.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So we're going to start with dry bulb. That, as Tony said, that's what we'll typically see in in our typical, temperature sensor thermostat. So basically dry bulb, and what you're going to notice as you go through different psychometric charts, like even if you were to Google psychometric chart right now, you're going to have different ranges. You're going to have different looks. So, when we show these points, when we show everything like that, like it's not, your psychometric chart is not always going to be negative 10 to 130. There may be different ranges that you're looking at, but typically the directions that you move within the chart and the orientations of the lines will be the same just because they're all relative to each other. Therefore, they all kind of have to have that in common. So for dry bulb, that's going to be your vertical lines, and we're going to be moving left to right. So as you see here, we're negative 10 degrees to 130 degrees, and that goes up the entire length of the chart.
So if you're to follow one of the, like, if you look at 90 degrees, anything on this blue line that's vertical,
yep,
above the 90, it means it's 90 degree dry bulb at that point, right?
Yep.
Okay. What about wet bulb?
Yeah, so for wet bulb, if we were to have Tony take his sling psychrometer cross country and go to a bunch of different places and spin it around, we would get a bunch of different wet bulb temperatures. And basically the way that the wet bulb temperatures work is we plot them on this chart. Right now, this example shows 50 degrees and 70 degrees. And then from that point, we draw them at, for lack of a better angle, like a 45-degree angle, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that shows you where those wet bulb lines are. And, basically your dry bulb can vary, right? So like if we look at the 50-degree wet bulb line, that 50-degree wet bulb line goes from 50-degree dry bulb, which makes sense. That's going to be when we're going to be fully saturated. We can't get below that because then our wet bulb would be higher than our dry bulb. As Tony said, we don't know, anything like that in existence. And then you can go up to, 90 degrees with that same wet bulb.
Excellent. So that's your wet bulb temperatures. And just a little shout out too, if you don't have a chart and want to follow along, there's a link in the chat. Courtney, if you want to post that again, and you can print that out, or you could just Google one, or, if you got one, pull it out. We're going to do some examples live on the psych chart. Okay. Go ahead with the dew point there, Kevin.
Yeah. So dew point temperature on the chart are these horizontal lines. They move from lower dew point up to higher dew point. Something that's important here to note is that they are not equally spaced at all points like we have on dry bulb on this chart. Higher on the chart, we have more space in between the dew point temperatures. Lower on the chart, we have less space. And this is going to be, your total moisture of air.
Thank you, sir. And what about these lines here?
Yeah, so relative humidity lines, and I feel like these are what really kind of makes that chart look so busy, are kind of these, swervy lines going throughout the chart. What's cool about the relative humidity lines is if we were to look at our wet bulb, which was that horizontal line, the way they define these lines was between 100% relative humidity and 0% relative humidity. That's how far along you are on your wet bulb line. So that's why you have this curve. So if you were on the 50% wet bulb line, that 50% relative humidity line would be exactly halfway on that wet bulb line.
Got it. Good explanation. Okay. And we got some grains here. What's going on with those?
Yeah, so grains of moisture, kind of going back to that dew point, as you can see, both grains of moisture and your dew point have to do with your total moisture in the air. So just like those, we are going to have those going across, moving from the bottom all the way up to the top. And these are going to be evenly spaced, unlike dew point. That's really the main difference. They both represent your total moisture in the air, but the grains of moisture, moving up and down the chart are going to be evenly distributed.
Thank you. And enthalpy or enthalpy, depending on where you're from in the country, right?
Yep. Yeah. So enthalpy moves in the same direction as your wet bulb. As your wet bulb lines, it's going to be, your total energy. So realistically, when this comes into play is when you're moving around the chart. That's really when you're seeing the difference in enthalpy, because that's the energy that's in the air. So Tony's going to go into moving around the chart on that, but these lines run parallel with the wet bulb lines.
Excellent. So now we're going to put them all together and we're going to see the chart kind of forming what it looks like, right?
Yep.
So we got the wet bulb lines. We draw in the dew point temperatures. The RH lines, I could have made these all a different color, but that would have taken like a billion years. And then there's the grains, enthalpy, and there you go. Now you have a simplified version of this. And this is the same thing really, except it's just got some tighter, increments, I should say. Okay, back to the chart. All right, so we're going to go through a few examples. So this is where it would be nice if you had a chart, if you want to follow along. If you're listening in the future, just pause this, go grab one with a link in the description, and you could follow along, which I know for me is super, super helpful when I'm trying to learn something. So I'm going to zoom in on this. Note too, this chart is at sea level. So if you're in Breckenridge, Colorado, or somewhere where you're not at sea level, be careful of what chart you're using. The chart we're going to use in this example is at sea level. So be careful of that. Okay, so let's start with dry bulb temperature. So if you have a chart, go ahead and I'm going to even make this a little bit bigger. Go ahead and find the dry bulb area and circle it, the dry bulb temperature. And we're going to find 95 degrees dry bulb. Now I'm going to try to use this highlighter tool, which failed me earlier, but okay, there's dry bulb temperature and there's 95 degrees. So if you got a chart, go ahead and pick those points out and take your straight edge and draw a line straight up the 95 degrees, like so. All right, so you've just drawn in a 95 degree line. So now you know where the 95 degrees. So anything on that line represents 95 degrees dry bulb. Okay. Let's do the same thing for 70 degrees. So find 70 degrees. Draw that line in. And now you've drawn in the 70 degrees. One thing I'll point out, which is very interesting, when I first started doing this demonstration and I was overlaying these blue lines on top of the chart, I noticed that when you go all the way up, that the lines are not perfectly horizontal on the chart. And at first I thought we had a defective chart. And then someone explained to me they're actually not perfectly horizontal or perfectly vertical, excuse me.
Vertical.
Can't remember for the reason why, but they're not, they are a little off. If you find a way to draw a straight edge on there, you'll see yourself. Okay, so that's dry bulb. You're now a dry bulb expert. Oops, let's go back here and let's do this. Now we're going to look at wet bulb. Okay, so wet bulb temperature, and we're going to look at 70 degrees wet bulb. So go ahead and find wet bulb on your chart. And the wet bulb temperature, 70 degrees, is right here. I'm going to highlight it there. And draw in the 70 degree line, which goes in this kind of manner here. Let me just draw it in on the computer here. Okay, so that's your 70 degree wet bulb line. So, you know, if you were to pick out a point right here, I'll highlight that. I don't know if you could see it, but that would be 95 degrees dry bulb and 70 degree wet bulb. That's how that would look. So next we'll find 55 degrees wet bulb, which is right here. And the associated line with it is along this line here. So there you go. That's 55 degree wet bulb. Okay, so I think you can get the picture here. We'll do the dew point as well. So the dew point temperatures, let's find 60 degree dew point. So the dew point is here. And depending on what chart you're using, Kevin pointed this out earlier, it may be in a different spot. So keep that in mind. You might have a chart and be like, oh, this is different. This is not where dew point is. So yes, we are going to explain the psychrometric processes. Thank you for the question. So 60 degree dew point is right here. Is that right? Okay. Make sure I'm not hitting the grains. And then there you go. So that's 60 degree dew point.
Yeah. Yeah. And if you notice, when we track that across, that also intersects with the 60 degree wet bulb point. And that is when we are going to be saturated. So that if our wet bulb,
what that means, Kevin, that's a good point.
Yeah. So what that means is that we are at the point of condensation, the point where we will start releasing moisture from it. You know, my saying is always, there's no crying in HVAC, there's only condensation. And that's when that's going to happen.
Oh boy. Your daughter is going to be in hysterics when she gets older.
I know. It's all those dad jokes. I'm ready.
Dad jokes, big time. And this, you know, we didn't point this out earlier, but I'm going to try to highlight this. But this is the saturation line that Kevin's talking about. So anyway, that was the messiest highlighting ever done.
Yeah, you got a weird mouse thing going on.
Ever. There's something going on with my mouse. It's kind of spiking there. Okay. So hopefully you all get the point there. So relative humidity, we'll go through this real quick because we're getting pretty long in time here. These are your relative humidity lines. And what we did is we highlighted the 50% and the 20%. So you can see that by, I went a little fast there. That's 50% there. And that's 20% there. Call these lines. They're actually curves, which I guess is a type of line. I don't know. Someone correct me if I'm wrong. But that's how the relative humidity looks. So, okay, moving right along. Enthalpy. Enthalpy is kind of strange on the chart. It's out here on these areas here. So if we were to look at 20, an enthalpy of 20, it would be right here. So what you do is you line this up with the 20 over here. You see these are kind of off the chart here. And then you take your straight edge and put it across and you draw that line on there. Okay.
Yeah. And typically in my experience, you're getting your enthalpy from other conditions because, you know, I don't know what device you would actually use to measure enthalpy in the air. I'm not positive.
Very good point. And that's a great segue into the last section. That would have been perfect. It was the next section, but we got to do moving around the chart first. Okay, so now we're going to move around the chart. So, and I hopefully this is helping some folks. If you have any questions, let us know. Just to give you a basic foundation of psychrometrics, and we'll go through and do some more details in part two. But so moving around the chart, somebody asked, "Are you going to explain the psychrometric processes in air AHUs, but in air conditioning in general?" And yes, and those psychrometric processes, when we say that, we're talking about cooling, heating, humidification, and dehumidification, right? So this is typically what we're talking about when we talk about the processes. Don't worry right now about seeing the chart. What we're trying to give you is an overall flow of when you move in this direction, here's what's happening. So don't really worry too much about the numbers. And you could draw this in on your chart too. This, if you're new, this will be helpful. So let's talk about cooling and heating. So to represent cooling and heating, or to look at that process, we're going to use the dry bulb temperatures. Okay. So the dry bulbs are at the bottom of the screen, or bottom of the chart. We're just going to draw in some lines for reference so you can get a visual of it. And we're picking two numbers just arbitrarily. So from 20 degrees on the left to 120 degrees on the right. So Kevin, you've been around a while. If I'm cooling the air, which direction on the chart am I moving in?
You are going to be going left.
Going to be going left. So this is a cooling process. So from a higher temperature to lower temperature is cooling. And you might have guessed it, for heating is from a lower temperature to a higher temperature, which is from left to right. So that's generally cooling and heating. When you're moving in those directions on the chart, that's the process you're following, okay? Next, we'll talk about humidification and dehumidification. And to illustrate that, we're going to look at the dew point lines, because dew point has to do with moisture in the air, as we talked about earlier. We'll draw in some dew point lines here, and I'll just put some arbitrary numbers here, 40, 70, and 85 degree dew point. So, Kevin, there's some weird places in the country where you actually add humidity to the air. I'm not really sure where that is, but if you were in that area and had to humidify the air, what direction would you be going in?
And we're going to be going up, and that's going to increase our dew point.
There you go. So now you're in humidifying, and dehumidifying is removing moisture, which is good when we're talking about air conditioning the air. Okay. Pretty simple stuff. Rarely are we going in a straight line on a psychrometric chart. So if we look at the processes, there's a summary there, but rarely you're going in a perfectly straight line. Most of the time you're doing that when you're heating, but usually there's a combination of the two. Okay. So when we're talking about like cooling and dehumidifying, which is what we do with cooling coils, air conditioning systems, we're cooling, which means we're going from a higher to lower temperature. We're dehumidifying, which means we're removing moisture, removing grains. And we're typically doing that in this type of fashion. So we're typically going, if you look at a cooling coil curve, it goes sensibly for a while, then it starts dipping down. That's cooling and dehumidifying as it's going down in that direction. And again, if you're heating and humidifying, heating, you would be moving from a lower temperature to a higher temperature, as you would expect. Adding humidity to the air, you're going up, which is increasing in the dew point, increasing in the grains, etc. And a combination of that would look something like in this general area. Okay. Did I miss anything, Kevin? Does that explain it, you think?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, good. Okay. So moving around the chart, now we're going to talk about determining air properties. Okay. So one of the great things about the chart, and Kevin alluded to this earlier, is if you know two of the properties, so if you have something like this, and you go out to the job site, it's backwards because I have my thing backwards, but it's 53 degree dew point, 54% RH. Or if you want to look really cool, go to a job site with one of these and you won't look cool. Don't go to a construction site with one of those. Or if you set this on, the common temperatures you're going to get are dry bulb and then relative humidity. So if you get those 2 points, any 2 points, you could find the other points on the chart. That's the purpose of this section. So let's go through a few examples here. So if you went to a job site and it was 75 degrees outside dry bulb and 50% relative humidity, what would these values be? Okay. This is a great tool as well when you're trying to learn. Like I said earlier, I actually have one of these in my bag now, but I have it because I do videos on it. But I used to have one in there, and I would go out to job sites with something like that and this, and I would actually plot it on here. And I would try to get the outdoor air. I would try to get the return. I would try to get the supply air, and you could kind of see psychrometrically what's happening. It's a really good way to learn what's actually going on in the air conditioning system. So this is a brand called, someone was asking me what type of humidity reader do you have? It's a Protmex, Protmex. Not really sure. Works pretty good. Okay, so let's go ahead and use the psychrometric chart to figure this out. So we know that it's 75 degrees dry bulb and 50% relative humidity. So what we do is we find those values on the chart, right? So I'm going to go back to my highlighter tool. I already spoiled where okay, so there's the 75 degrees dry bulb, and you could draw a line there. And 50% relative humidity is right here. So you draw in that curve right there. Okay, so where these intersect is what's important. So now at that point, you can pull any data off the chart you need, which is very, very helpful, like Kevin said earlier. Good for troubleshooting too, right, Kevin?
Yeah, absolutely. Troubleshooting, understanding your loads and how you're, moving around the chart as well.
For sure. Okay, so let's start filling these in. So let's determine the wet bulb. So what you do is you take this point and you draw a line up to the wet bulb, and you circle the wet bulb, and you determine that it's 62 degrees wet bulb. Okay, so you don't have to have a reader at the job site that can pick up everything. You just got to get 2 points. And again, the easiest ones are usually dry bulb and relative humidity in my experience. Okay, so what about the humidity? So the humidity, again, is represented on this chart by the grains. It's called humidity ratio. Some charts just call it humidity, which is the grains per pound of dry air. So what is the grains? So what you would do is just draw a line from that point using your straight edge over to here, and you'll see that the grains are 65. Now be careful not to mix up the grains with the dew point because they're awfully close. Let me see if I could zoom in on that. Okay, so see how the grains are right here, but the dew point's over in this area here. So just be careful of that. And then the dew point, now I'm going to go back here, is, as you can see right there, 55 degrees. Okay. And then to get the enthalpy, what you would do is take your straight edge, drive it through that point in a way that it lines up. You got to do a little bit of this action so that it lines up on the enthalpy and you get your enthalpy. Something like that, which is 28 BTUs per pound. Okay. Why don't we do one more of those because we're getting a little long on time, and then we'll see if anybody has questions. Okay, so example 2. So this was a beautiful, I think, late September, October day at my house. It was 78-ish degrees and 27.3% relative humidity. So if we take that, and that's this thing right here, we can find the wet bulb, dew point, and enthalpy easily just by going through what we just did. So you would first plot the 2 known points, which is 78 degrees and 27% relative humidity. And then you get that point. And then off of that, you could pull the other points. So wet bulb temperature, you follow the wet bulb line from that point to the saturation line. In this case, it's about 57 and a half to be exact. To get the dew point, you just follow the line horizontally to the right, and you circle that and get the dew point, which would be 41. I don't ask for the grains here, but it looks like about 38 grains, something like that. And then enthalpy, again, you just would draw straight through there and pick out your enthalpy. All right, Kevin, what do you think?
Yeah, no, I mean, that looks great. Looks like a comfortable day. I wish I had that today.
Yeah, really. I know, right? Okay, so let's see here. So I don't want to go too long here. So in summary, we talked about the properties of air. We looked at building the chart. We looked at moving around the chart or the psychrometric processes. And then we did some examples of determining air properties. So is that all I need to know? Am I a psychrometric genius, a master of the No. So that's just the beginning point, right? One of the things I will say about investing some time in learning this is really you don't need 3 months of training to know the basics of psychrometrics, right? You could really spend just a couple hours and get the basics down and learn a lot of this in the field. So the next presentation we're going to do, we're going to focus on air mixing, sensible heat ratios, constant volume systems, psychrometrics, and full and part load. And then we get in more detail in the psychrometrics in part 3. So stay tuned for part 2. We're going to be announcing that at some point. Kevin, if you want to stick around after this, we'll pick a date and we'll try to figure out what's best for everybody, and we'll launch in part 2. Heather, you want to put the PDH email up? So for your PDH credits, email me. I do have to go through some questions here per the New York and New Jersey rules, but they're real quick and real simple. So let's throw some questions up here. Okay, who is credited with the creation of the first psychrometric chart? Willis Carrier. Okay. Somebody said that out there, I'm sure. So I'm going to just put that in there. Which property of air is a better indicator of the amount of moisture, dew point, or relative humidity? We talked about that several times in the presentation. So dew point. One of the things we didn't talk about is why do we measure relative humidity often when we're trying to determine the properties of air, or determine the moisture in the air? That's because it's less expensive to measure RH than it is to measure dew point. So what we do is we typically measure the dry bulb and the RH, and then we calculate the dew point in the computer or in an app, run a psychrometric chart. By the way, there's a bunch of apps that does a lot of this stuff too, but I think learning on the paper is invaluable, at least in my experience. Hey, thanks for the answer. We're getting some answers flying in. So it's about 30 seconds behind when we talk. So what psychrometric processes occur when we move from right to left on the psychrometric chart? So from right to left is from a higher temperature to a lower temperature. So that would be cooling. And on the psychrometric chart, our grains per pound of dry air represented by horizontal or vertical lines. We need some of that Jeopardy music here. So that would be horizontal lines. And one more question here. Thank you for all the answers. Using the psychrometric chart as a guide, how many properties of air do you need to know to look up all the properties? And the answer is 2. Okay. So please stay tuned for part 2. Again, email me. The email is right there for your PDH credits. I will also send out an email with a link to this presentation if you want to share it or need a refresher. And we'll also let you know as soon as part 2 is available. So if anybody has any questions, we will stick around for a minute or two with Raygun here and see if we can answer your questions. Kevin, any last words while people figure out if they want to stay around for another 5 hours or go do something fun?
No, thank you everyone for joining. Again, as much as this part was the building blocks, I think having this as reference for the next 2 phases we get into are important, to have those building blocks to be able to then move around and understand what's going on the chart.
Great. We did such a brilliant job. We didn't get any questions today. So, or we haven't got any questions in a while. We got some earlier, but okay. Thank you all for watching. Before you leave, if you don't mind liking this video, and if you want to share it with your feed, that would be great too. We really appreciate your support. It's been a lot of fun for us to do these presentations. And again, we look forward to giving back. You could check out the video version. If you're listening to this on the podcast in the future, you can check out the video version on our YouTube channel, which is go to YouTube and type in @HVAC-TV, and you can pull that up and watch it anytime and share it. We do have a new playlist on our YouTube channel called HVAC 101, which has really been a tremendous help for some new folks starting in the field. There's a ton of experts on there. Luckily, I'm not the only one on there doing the presentations. There's some people on there who really, really know their stuff. And it goes through the basics of psychrometrics. It talks about pump curves, fan laws, acoustics, all the real basic fundamental sciences. And I think there's about 50 videos in there. So they're really top notch. They're not commercial. Just go in there and you could share the HVAC 101 playlist with your team, and hopefully they'll get a lot out of it. The email for the PDH, Valentina's asking. Heather, do you mind putting that back up again? So there's the email for the PDH. Most of you I think everybody registered here with an email, and I'll send an email that too, but that sometimes go to spam. So if you don't see it, please just email me there and we'll get that to you. So, all right, Kevin, you want to stick around for a minute in the waiting room? So I'm going to
absolutely
stick around the minute for the waiting room. And I'm going to put up some QR codes. If you all want to connect with us on our YouTube channel or our podcast, feel free to do that. Kevin, I'll see you in a minute.
Great. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.